Piero della Francesca has been seen as one of the mystery men of Western art, a painter of enigmatic images rendered with mathematical precision and monumental vision, but which are often strange and elusive, haunting even. He was overlooked for centuries and subsequently was seen as a precursor to the achievements of Leonardo, Michelangelo and Raphael. But he's now recognised as their equal. Piero della Francesca was born around 1413 here in the town of what was then called Borgo San Sepolcro, now just San Sepolcro, then as now a thriving commercial centre on the Umbrian-Tuscan borders. His father was a tanner, but also a successful wool dealer. And the young Piero went to abacus school and studied mathematics, effectively training for a career as a merchant. We know very little about his life. We do know of 26 surviving paintings, most still in situ. Nevertheless, some kind of life story can be pieced together, and by his late teens, there's evidence that he'd chosen the path of an artist. But San Sepolcro must have seemed too small for a young man with ambition, and like many, he decided to travel. Piero went first to Perugia, where he met a celebrated regional painter, Domenico Veneziano, and the two of them came here to Florence in 1439 and worked together on the decorations of the walls of a church which has now been destroyed. Now, Florence was this extraordinary cradle of culture. There'd been a rebirth of classicism 50 years or so before, and by this time, by the time Piero was here, there was an extraordinary flourishing of scholarship and arts, which no doubt fueled the young artist. The next few years remained something of a blank, but we know that around the age of 30, Piero returned to his hometown of San Sepolcro. Piero's first major work as an independent artist was this one, and we know that he signed a contract in 1445 to an organisation, a Compagnia, who were dedicated to Santa Maria della Misericordia, or the Blessed Virgin Mary of Pity and Charity, which had an oratory or a building on the edge of San Sepolcro, which it used to minister to the sick and the poor. And this was an altarpiece commissioned for the little chapel there. Now, the structure of it is quite complicated, but it follows an existing altarpiece that Piero had to paint over, and the frame, which would have been wonderfully elaborate, is lost. And this reconstruction has all of Piero's work, all the panels, but the ornate frame that binds it together is lost. Nonetheless, this work, called the Misericordia altarpiece, is unified not because of Piero's style, which actually is very varied in this work, but because of the way he has a gold background that gives an ethereal glow to the work which binds all pieces together, and because the 5 major figures in the work, 4 saints and the Virgin herself at the centre, are standing on the same stone step, which seems to cut through space and time. Now, the work began in 1445 with the 2 figures on the left-hand side. On the extreme left, St. Sebastian, a saint who was deemed to protect people from the plague, and therefore had a great relevance to the Compagnia. And then St. John the Baptist. And the Baptist is painted in a radical way. First of all, his halo signifies his saintliness, but look, it's painted with real perspective, even though it's faded over the ages. Secondly, he clutches himself like so, and his eyes are lowered as if he's focusing inwards on himself. In fact, some art historians have described it as a rather fanatical image. I think it's more mystical than fanatical. And then the crowning glory of Piero's first phase in painting this work, the crucifixion, which is above the Virgin Mary, and the Virgin Mary herself is clad in black and reaches out in a very dramatic gesture to her son, with John the Evangelist on the right-hand side seemingly running towards and opening himself up to his Lord and Master and Saviour. Now, a few years later, Piero paints in a style that's more relaxed, more calm. Some people think the emotion is deeper, I certainly do. And he completes the picture with 2 saints here on the right-hand side. On the extreme right is San Bernardino, a local saint from Siena, who died in 1444 and was canonised in 1450. And the fact that Piero has a halo above him means that he must have painted this image sometime soon after 1450. Now, Bernardino was part of a Franciscan order. He was a celebrated preacher who was part of a kind of religious revival or renewal that was going on through Tuscany and Umbria at this time. And then, to his left, St. John the Evangelist, author of the 4th Gospel, holding the book, leading into the central image, Mary, who actually is much smaller than life-size, but when you look at the picture, she seems a colossal figure because of the way she towers over her devotees who are kneeling at her feet, women on the right, men on the left. They're the figures with which we, and certainly the faithful who came to this in the 15th and 16th centuries, would identify with. And also, it reminds us that the cult of Mary, or Mariolatry, was rife during the 14th and 15th centuries. In fact, it's been estimated that of all churches built in the 14th and 15th centuries, more than a third of them were dedicated, in various forms, to the Virgin Mary.
Piero's reputation was clearly spreading because around 1450 he received a commission from the Lord of Rimini, Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta. Piero paints him life-size and tries to show the world that Sigismondo wasn't just a successful soldier, nor the despot he was portrayed as by his various enemies. He kneels at the feet of his saintly namesake, whose bones are actually buried in the chapel in which the painting was made. And Piero's job as an artist is to try and bring everything back to life. But the majority of Piero's work remained in the town of his birth.
This work was painted around 1455 when Piero was living in San Sepolcro and was part of a much larger altarpiece for the church in San Sepolcro, Santa Maria della Pieve, where all the local baptisms took place, with the central panel, as we can see here, depicting the baptism of Christ. All the traditional elements are there. The old believers of the city of Jerusalem in the background, the new believers stripping off, with Christ, St. John the Baptist and the three angels. He makes it local though. The landscape, which he pays a good deal of attention to, is that of San Sepolcro and the Valley of the Walnuts as it was known, with a walnut tree here in the foreground over Christ's head. There are two curious aspects to this painting though. One is the fact that Christ and St. John look as if they're standing in a dry riverbed, but in fact Piero has very acutely observed the optical phenomenon of reflection and the angle of sunlight. Also, he's reflecting the biblical myth that there's a miracle that takes place in the Jordan when Christ is baptized and the flow is reversed. The second aspect is geometry. Scholars have related Piero's work and his compositions to the work of the great classical mathematician Euclid. To the naked eye, though, it's much easier to see this line, this central axis that starts at the very top of the arch, goes straight down through the dove or Holy Spirit, through the water that's being poured onto Christ's head, and straight down through his face and down through his hands. And everything emanates from that line. That's bang at the centre of the picture. And it's that idea, this geometric idea, that sets the tone for much of Piero's subsequent work.
A marked sense of geometry looms large in this, perhaps the oddest of all Piero's works, made around 1458. It shows the flagellation of Christ, tied to a column, being whipped by curiously languid Roman soldiers, while Pontius Pilate looks on. In the foreground, three men dressed in the clothes of contemporary aristocrats seem oblivious to what's happening. There have been numerous interpretations of the work and its iconography, the most interesting of which relates the three men to diplomats in the conflict between Christendom and the Turks. But the impact of the painting is spatial. It's like a giant chessboard on which the figures have been placed, and the perspective is so elaborately worked out that it can actually be reproduced in plan and elevation, creating a claustrophobic stage set in which a brutal ritual nonchalantly takes place.
In 1458, Piero comes here to Rome to decorate the papal apartments of Pius II, work which was subsequently covered up a few decades later by Raphael. But then, according to reports, Piero hears news that his mother's died, so he returns back north to San Sepolcro. It seems likely that sometime soon after the death of his mother, Piero began to work on one of his most celebrated and popular images, this one, the Madonna del Parto. Now, the Madonna del Parto means the Madonna of the Delivery, which is slightly a misnomer because she's not giving birth here, but is clearly in a heavily pregnant state. And the work resides in the small hill town of Monturchi, about 6 miles or so from San Sepolcro, and it was in a church where there was an altarpiece already in existence, and Piero painted this fresco over it, and it's now been moved to a rather drab school building behind protective glass to protect it from all the pilgrims who come from all over the world to look at it. Essentially, it's an image of revelation. The two angels on either side of the Virgin pull open this canopy or tent to reveal her, And at the same time, it mirrors the gesture that she's making with her hand, pointing to her womb, the idea of what's inside and what is about to burst forth, which in turn rhymes with this amazing space that Piero has created from the canopy behind her. And this idea of flip rhythms and rhymes in the painting is wonderfully exemplified with the two angels, who in fact, if you look at, are a mirrored image, one of the other. And this stems from the fact that Piero seems to have used the same cartoon or drawing, sketch, from one to the other, but just reversed it. And he's done the same with the colours of their robe and their wings, this browny red and green. The heart of the picture, and the dominant, most dramatic central image, is the opening in the Virgin's dress, to which she points. And we read this in two ways. Firstly, vaginal. This is the opening through which Christ will be born. But we also read it as a wound. And in a way, this anticipates or prophesies Christ's wounds on the cross. So in an image of birth, death is also present. But Mary, as the carrier of the Christ child, is also a symbol of hope, because through the birth of Christ, people will be saved. It's a route to salvation and redemption. People come from all over the world to look at this image, but its power is enhanced by our knowledge of what it was originally intended for. When it was there as an altarpiece in a church, it formed part of a cult that had developed in the 14th century throughout Tuscany and then into Umbria, where pregnant women would come to pray in front of images like this for the safe delivery of their child. And those who couldn't conceive came to pray for fecundity or fertility, that they might themselves have children. And when we look at this image and we compare it, say, to other images that Piero's made of the Virgin Mary, it seems more personalised, less generalised. And we can't help but think that this might have something to do with his own relationship to his mother and his state of mind after her death.
The Madonna del Parto is perhaps Piero's most explicitly personal painting, but it was soon to be eclipsed by the most ambitious work of his entire life.
Piero della Francesca's most spectacular work is here in the Cappella Maggiore in the church of San Francisco in the hill town of Arezzo. He began the work sometime around the middle of the 1450s, and we know he'd finished it by 1466. An epic saga in fresco, filling the wall with 15 or so grand scenes telling the story of the true cross. Now, the piece was commissioned by a wealthy mercantile family, the Bacci, but the tone of the piece was established by the Franciscan order who ran this church. And from the beginning, Piero was original. He wanted to experiment and innovate, not least with the technique of fresco. Now, traditionally, it's done on wet plaster, which Piero does to begin with. But restoration and cleaning has shown that, in fact, he also used tempera and oils on top of the surface of the fresco once it had dried to give it a kind of luster and a sheen. Tragically, in the 19th century, these frescoes were badly restored and there was damp in them, and so some of them have been obliterated, but there's still enough here for us to see quite what an achievement it is. Now, the story of the true cross effectively is a 13th century epic saga that details the cross as an instrument of salvation, how it's lost and found and finally restored to Jerusalem, and all of that is told by Piero. But from the beginning, he has his own original vision. So he starts right at the top with something totally from his own imagination. That is, the aging Adam and Eve talking to their 3 children about the consequences of their original sin, from which, of course, salvation springs in the form of the cross. And from then on in, it's a saga really of Hunt the Cross in various forms, in the various images that he paints. Historians tell us that a contemporary audience would have made immediate sense of this work. But I find it an amazingly complex experience, where your eyes are drawn from left to right, from right to left, up and down, and crossways. And it seems to me there's the logical mind of a rather complex mathematician at work here. What I like is how you start to make these extraordinary juxtapositions, the most powerful of which are the 2 vast battle scenes that are on the lowest walls that in fact are closest to the viewer. Starting on the far wall with an image of Constantine, the first Christian emperor, defeating the infidel who scramble out of the river and off into the distance without any violence at all. All he does is show the cross to them. And rather than using military might, a miracle has taken place. On this wall, mirroring the non-battle scene we've just seen over there, Piero produces one of the most powerful depictions of a battle, I think, anywhere in Italian art. It reveals itself to you in different ways and in different facets every time you look at it. For a start, Piero seems to have done 7 or 8 layers deep of soldiers, 3 or 4 of which you could say are unnecessary, but he wants to marshal this idea of chaos. And when you look at the work, you see extraordinary images, expressions of fear, of anger, of humility, odd vignettes, like the limbs of a figure on the extreme left-hand side, bent at the knee and framing a head that's been decapitated. And it's one of those works that seems both intensely personal as well as universal. And in fact, we know that Piero may have witnessed the celebrated Battle of Anghiari in 1440 when the Milanese fought the Florentines, but also we do know that in 1453 he was issued with a crossbow by the commune of San Sepolcro in case he needed to fight in a battle against the Neapolitans. And so this sense of claustrophobia and of being involved is probably the result of some kind of direct experience. The real impact of this work, though, through its ambition, through its scale, through its drama, through its sheer bravura, is that it seems to push Piero della Francesca right to the forefront of Italian and indeed Western art, even though it was centuries before that genius was fully recognised.
As far as we can tell, Piero remained unmarried and childless. It may be something of a cliché, but it seems that he was married to his life as an artist.
In 1459, this large building was given over to the people of San Sepolcro as a meeting place, and Piero della Francesca, as already the most distinguished artist in town, was given a commission to produce a work of art, and this is the result. Now, most works of art in places like this are explicit depictions of civic virtue. This, though, is almost unique because it's a religious subject matter and one of the most difficult, the resurrection of Christ, which is alluded to in the Gospels but not explicitly described. Now, why would Piero do that? Well, I think the most obvious answer is because here he is, having burst out of the Holy Sepulchre, burst out of the tomb, and of course San Sepolcro is named after the sepulchre, and the myth is that fragments from Christ's tomb were brought here in the 1st or 2nd century after his death. Piero's approach to depicting the resurrection is highly individual, highly original. We're down below, perhaps 6 or 7 feet from the bottom of the work. We look up to it. What we're confronted by initially are the 4 soldiers, some sleeping, one shielding his eyes as if he can't bear to look at that which we are looking at. But then we see the Holy Sepulchre. Now, there's an element of mystery here because we can't see how Christ has got out. We can't see if the lid of the sepulchre has been pushed to one side. And in a way, Piero manages to maintain the mystery of the resurrection by not showing us too much. On the other hand, when he shows us Christ, he shows us a huge amount, a muscular figure, credible, believable, as if one of us, although slightly larger than us, larger than life. But also, he shifted the perspective again, because it's as if, when we look at Christ, we're on the same level as him. He's painted Christ as if he shares the same plane. And by doing that, he suggests a real man having broken through death, rather than the sometimes fairy story-like depictions you get of Christ floating upwards above the tomb. And then look at Christ's eyes. This is the most extraordinary thing, I think, about the painting. He confronts us. They're hypnotic. This isn't the image of a gentle saviour. This is the image of someone who's gone through the night, who for 3 days has been wrestling with death and has finally conquered. And he holds the standard of the red cross that symbols his triumph over death. On the left-hand side, there are trees with no leaves on. On the right-hand side, the trees do have leaves. And that's a much flatter path. This is a much more rugged and steep path. And there's a choice being given here. And it's a moral painting. You have 2 choices. You can take the easy way that doesn't lead anywhere in particular, or you can take the hard slog, the passage of virtue. And this, I think, is the point of having the painting in this particular context. Because in the next room, this is where meetings took place and also where judgments were made. And in a way, Piero is using the central image of Christianity, the resurrection, as a way more practically of saying to people, judges and those who are about to be judged, to choose the more difficult but the virtuous path. There's a neat postscript to this painting, because it's widely believed that the soldier leaning back against the tomb with his eyes closed is Piero himself, and that this in fact is a self-portrait. Of course, we don't know, but there's a neat twist, I think, to this, because most artists, when they depict themselves in their work, have their eyes open, looking out at us, looking at their work. But Piero, one of the most enigmatic and mysterious figures in the history of Western art, chooses to paint himself with his eyes closed. And ironically, this work and this image is perhaps the closest we ever get to him.
In the 1470s, Piero made the short journey to Urbino for a very illustrious commission. He'd been summoned to the court there to paint a double portrait of Federico da Montefeltro and his young wife, Battista Sforza, who was only 26 when she died in July 1472, having borne 8 daughters and finally a son and heir. Piero's portrait of the couple is believed to have been painted posthumously as a tribute from Federico to his wife. It's unusual to have a woman on the viewer's left, as this was considered the honorary position, but it's also to avoid showing his missing right eye, lost in a joust that also shattered his nose. For the remaining 20 years of his life, Piero stayed in San Sepolcro. During the mid-1470s, Piero began to write a book on perspective. This, more than his paintings, ensured that he was initially remembered after his death. At the heart of Piero's studies was an analysis of the proportions of the human body, which can be seen as part of an ongoing program in Renaissance scholarship where man is seen as the centre of all things. But Piero's so much more than a student of mathematical formulae, for his art shows that the human imagination is the real measure. Having spent his life painting works for other people, Piero seems to have ended his career with a work for himself, possibly for his family tomb. The work, in the past so harshly cleaned that the surface is damaged, shows the Nativity, with the shepherds visible in the background, and an angelic choir strumming and singing above the vulnerable Christ child, who lies on his mother's robe in the foreground. It's an odd, disjointed image, but it's a joyful picture, where Piero seems to have shed his customary sombreness in favour of a loud celebration, and with the sacred scene once again transported from the Holy Land to the outskirts of San Sepolcro. Piero died in 1492, his fame rapidly diminishing, partly because the great geniuses of the High Renaissance were about to burst onto the scene, and also because his work was in such mainly obscure places. But 400 years later, his reputation began to flourish. Cézanne and Picasso both hailed him. Today, thousands make the Piero pilgrimage to Italy, yet he still remains the most enigmatic of all the great artists.